Good morning. So I just want to dedicate this class to the tragedy of last week, and I picked a subject that maybe will help us a little bit get a better understanding of how Judaism looks at an overarching responsibility, not only the individual responsibility, but a communal responsibility to things, and how in Judaism it got shaped, and ultimately how the Rebbe put his stamp on talking about a communal responsibility for each other outside of the individual responsibility for each other. I'll work it through the issue. But I first want to just, as usual, as over the years of doing this class, introduce you with a story with the Rebbe, so you'll get a better understanding of how he thinks. So if you look at my sheets that I gave you, there's a beautiful picture. It's actually from a book, the front cover of a book of a very influential Jew, a Holocaust survivor that made it to the States in the 40s and got very involved. His name was Dr. Jacob Griffiths. Got very involved in bringing Jews over, Hayas. And he was one of the original big personalities in Hayas. And he got into the oil business, so financially he was a very successful man, and he used his money towards helping immigrants make it over and resettling them in the States, resettling them in Israel, resettling them in Europe, wherever he could help. He was very influential. And he quickly realized in the early 50s.
Right?
He came through Hayas. There was a lot of people that came, and this was Hayas started right then. You know, and he was in the early part of Hayas. And he actually gave out a book. He was from Istanbul. They gave out a whole book on him about his life history. A little piece of his life history was that in the 50s, when he came to New York and he was working out of New York, he quickly realized that he needed the Rebbe's guidance in working with the international community of Jews. So he really began to listen to the Rebbe and wouldn't make decisions without talking to the Rebbe. And he realized that in addition to the Hayas, what he was working on, in his business, he started to ask the Rebbe for advice in investments in the oil and companies, and in America, then was starting up oil in LA, and they were beginning to find oil in all different parts of America. This is Alaska and all this. He was an investor. This man was a broker. And he befriended, at that time the Rebbe had one of the major fundraisers for the Lubavitch movement. That was the Rebbe's, one of the Rebbe's people that fundraised and ran around the world fundraising for Chabad. Was a man by the name of Rabbi Yosef Weinberg. He was a fundraiser. That was his. And he befriended Dr. Griffith because Dr. Griffith was a wealthy man. He used him as a supporter for Chabad activities.
Was he a medical doctor?
No, but he was a doctor of philosophy. In the early 60s, Dr. Griffith was in Omaha, Nebraska. Or I think maybe Oklahoma City, or Omaha, Nebraska. I think it's Oklahoma City. Doing a deal in the oil business. And he came back from doing the deal, or about to do the deal, and he realized he's uncomfortable with it. And it's in the evening. So he called up Rabbi Weinberg, and he told Rabbi Weinberg what the deal was, and why he's uncomfortable. And he has to be 9 a.m. at a meeting tomorrow to sign it, and he doesn't know if he should sign it. Could he write down the problem that he hears, take the note to the Rebbe's room, and give it to the Rebbe. So Rabbi Weinberg quickly wrote down the whole issue and went to the Rebbe's office. And the Rebbe received mail, I think 3 times a day from the U.S. Post Office. Mail came. And Rabbi Weinberg was hoping to catch the secretary before he goes in with the 3rd day of mail delivery, so he'll give it to the Rebbe then and ask him to put it on the top and get an answer right away. But he missed it. He was already in the Rebbe's room, the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Chadakov, and he realized he missed it. But the man needs an answer by 9 a.m. So he took the note and he put it in the crack of the door. hoping that when the Rebbe's secretary comes out of the room, he'll see the note in the crack of the door and he'll take it. And he stood from the distance while the Rebbe's secretary walked out of the room in a very respectful way, never turned his back to the Rebbe. That's disrespectful to a person of prestige. You turn your back to them. So he backed his way out of the room and opened the door, and he didn't notice that there's something. He didn't notice. And the thing flooded to the floor. And he closed the door. And the Rebbe noticed it. And Rabbi Weinberg says, as the door was closing, he saw the Rebbe stand up from his chair, walk over, and pick up the note. And 10 minutes later, he buzzed his secretary, saying to him, tell Dr. Griffel not to worry, it's a good deal, he should go forward with it, and return to New York. It's non-issue what he's worried about. It's a solid deal. After Rabbi Weinberg passed on to Dr. Griffel the Rebbe's answer, he felt horribly guilty. He made the Rebbe stand up. He made the Rebbe walk over and bend down. You talk about, it was like, he was like, see, he wrote an apology letter to the Rebbe. He said to the Rebbe, I'm sorry that what I did caused you to have to get up and bend down. It's not the right way to do things, throw things on the floor and make someone pick it up from the floor. It's not a respectful thing. And the Rebbe responded to his apology, and I want to tell you the words the Rebbe said. In Hebrew, the Rebbe said, Halei kol inyoni ufein. I'll translate. Beyichud Sachen was andere vergessen. The Rebbe said, it's my purpose and my responsibility in life to pick things up. Wow. And especially when it comes to things that other people oversee. They don't recognize the significance. It's an amazing line of the Rebbe. Rebbe,
a humble man.
A humble man. He said, this is my responsibility. I have a responsibility in life. My responsibility in life is to figure out how to pick things up. I want to talk to you about this word responsibility. Because in Judaism, we talk about to love someone else. You shall love thy fellow Jew. In Judaism, we talk about loving God. But we talk about loving someone else. And then we turn around and say that, it's upside down. And then we turn around and say that it's not about loving someone else. There's this concept, you're responsible. Well, responsible and loving is two different meanings. So I want to teach you, and we'll get to talking about responsible. I'm going to shape it for you. And I want to go back to the origins of this famous line that you're responsible for somebody else. Because that's a line that the Talmud said, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh. All Jews. You know what an Arev is? An Arev is a guarantor. Takes responsibility for someone else. That's the line of the Talmud. Where did they come up with that line? How do you know you're a guarantor for someone else? What makes you responsible? You can say to me that, you know what, you should love someone else. But now you're saying to me that there's an additional reality here. That in addition to loving somebody, you're responsible for somebody. What does that mean? So I'm going to show it to you and show you how the Talmud establishes this principle. And in its establishment, without the Talmud saying it, you're going to begin to understand there's a fundamental difference between being responsible and being and loving. Listen to the Talmud. This is the first time the Talmud and the Medrash uses this line of responsibility. It's in the portion of the Torah where Moses is speaking to the Jews before they're going up to the land of Israel. And he turns to them, he says, it's a land, it's a blessed land. And if you're going to behave, and if you're going to do good things, the land will be fruitful, and you'll be successful. And then starts the rebuking. And it's twice a year, by the way, that we have the rebuking. We have the rebuking in the springtime right before Shavuot, and then we have the rebuking in the summertime right before Rosh Hashanah. Two different parts of the Torah portion. In Leviticus, end of Leviticus, and at the end of Deuteronomy, where Moshe repeats the rebuking. And in the rebuking, he says, when you're going to do wrong, you know what's going to happen? People are going to be running and tripping over each other. So the words are, and this is my aim, and they will stumble one man by his brother. So in the language of the Torah, it seems like that you're not just running alongside the person and stumbling, you're both falling. No, one is causing the other to stumble. What do you mean one is causing the other to stumble? So Rashi says, let's read it. It's not written one man because of his brother, but one man by his brother, the sin of his brother. That you're responsible for the sin. You're causing that sin and you're responsible for it. We're blaming you for it. Why? Because it's taught that all Israels are responsible one for another. So the fact that the Torah wrote the verse in a way that lays the responsibility on both people, the person that's stumbling and the person who's causing the stumbling, shows that there's an interconnection. And you can't say, you know what, I didn't ask you to do it. Don't listen to me. Why are you listening to what I say? No, you can't say that. When the other person stumbles because of what you said, you share in the responsibility of that stumble. Why? Why can't you simply say, don't listen? I'm not responsible for you. And by the way, that's an American law. In American law, to a certain degree, a person has a right to say, you don't listen to what I say. So I say, do this. So I said, so what? You're an adult. You're a mature adult. Don't do it. So, in comes this law of responsibility in a whole negative connotation. You know what the negative connotation is? That I know you're responsible for somebody, not because you're doing something positive with them. Negative. To the contrary, you're doing something negative. And in that negativity, there's a right for the Torah to say that there's a concept of because you're responsible, you share that negativity. So, let's now go back to loving a fellow Jew. Can you imagine if I turned around and said to you, hello, I love you, and let's go rob the store together. And then turn to God and say, look, give me credit for loving a fellow Jew because I shared my love with him. And I took him out to rob a store. That doesn't work. You don't get brownie points, and God says, oh, you love the fellow Jew. Yeah, you robbed the store together, but you love the fellow Jew. You're sharing the robbery with him. You would never couch loving a fellow Jew in the context of a derogatory act. But you're going to couch the concept of responsibility for a fellow Jew in a derogatory act. Why? Because there's a fundamental difference between the two. What's the fundamental difference? The concept of loving a fellow Jew is an individual act, one person to another. You look at somebody and God says to you, look at him with a positive view. It's not a communal thing. It's the individual person that God looks at you and says, I need you to look at people and love them. Individually. And every individual you love, that you're fulfilling the mitzvah. The concept of I'm responsible is not about the individual. It's God introducing the idea of a community. Connecting. That all of a sudden, the concept of being responsible for someone else is because there's a communal responsibility. And that's why the first time you get introduced to this concept of responsibility is the land of Israel. Because until the land of Israel, there was no community. They're in the desert. They're traveling. What community are you talking about? People are putting up tents. There's no interconnection. There's no sharing a greater responsibility. And therefore, to a certain degree, the concept of you're responsible for another person doesn't have a housing. How does that develop? The first time it starts developing is they go to the land of Israel. And now in the land of Israel, we share a land. And it's like the old parable in the Medrash. You're on a boat, and you decide to drill a hole in your cabin because you would like to have water, your mattress to be somehow or another water floating on the water. And you look at the other cabins and say, ignore me. What do you care what I'm doing in my cabin? That doesn't do with your cabin. You don't drill a hole in your cabin. And go explain to the person, 1 second, you're not an individual anymore. You're part of this collective family here. We're all on this boat together. And your cabin, although yes, the door locks and you have privacy, but the reality is there's an interconnection. There's a collective truth. And you're drilling a hole in your boat is going to affect, in your room is going to affect me. But you have to have that boat. So if I want to make a pothole in my backyard, I have a right to do that. Why do I have a right? Because it's my backyard. Don't come onto my property. And you come onto my property, make sure you know what's on my property, that I have a pothole. But I can't go to a communal site and make a pothole because I share that with others. And now I'm responsible. In Judaism, the first time we're introduced to being responsible for somebody else is when we're talking about this collective responsibility. It's not the individual. It's when we become a community. When did they become a community? In Israel. And therefore, Moses turns to them and says, I want to tell you something. That when you go to the land of Israel, part of that privilege of being in the land of Israel, there's a flip side. That when things are not going right, you're responsible for each other. Because there's a collective overarching, and the way I'm going to teach you you're responsible for each other is when you're doing bad to each other. That you can't say, no, ignore what I do. Don't listen to me. It makes no difference what I say. No, you affect people. And in affecting people, that negative effect, you are part of that responsibility. And therefore, you look at this Medrash and the Talmud on page A, and you quickly realize that God intended to introduce the idea of responsibility separate from love. So loving your fellow Jew was given right at the beginning of the whole story of Judaism. To love thy fellow Jew is one of the mitzvot, one of the 613. But that has nothing to do with being responsible for a person. That's an individual act of one person to another. The term that you're responsible for somebody is in a communal setting. And to the contrary, it's not about individuals anymore. And therefore, to a certain degree, you can end up being responsible for an individual that you had no idea. You had no idea. You started something, it has a rippling effect, and now down the line, 6 people down the line, you're responsible. But I started it here. But when you're in a communal setting, you're not an individual. And in that communal setting, that rippling effect goes down the line. And you're responsible for the community. You're part of this community. It's like the boat. There's no other way of translating it. Loving your fellow Jew is a direct act with one person. Now, the fact that I love you, and you therefore are a good person, and down the line you do good things, I don't know if I get credit for that. That's already removed from me. I only get credit for the fact that I loved you. Now you're good to your wife and your children because someone else, that's down the line. It's an indirect thing. It's not part of my responsibility was to love you. Without any motives, just simply to love you. What the effects down the line is not part of what the obligation of the mitzvah. In a communal responsibility, it's absolutely down the line. Because it's communal, it's not about the individual. So you started something here with one person, but you don't realize that in a communal setting, it goes down the line. And that's all, and you're responsible for that.
How far?
How far? That's a very good question. That's a very good question. And let me tell you something, there's different commentaries to how far this works.
How far should they take my responsibility?
Correct. How far? And that's a very good question, which is a subject of its own. It's really a subject of its own to understand how far we take it. But I'm not going to go there because that's, sixth generation. People talk about generations of responsibility to what you do in the community, where you're responsible. Therefore, let's turn to page 2, and I'm going to show it to you, that Rashi, at the end towards the end of Deuteronomy, clearly states it. And Rashi says like this, listen to Rashi's words. He did not punish the community until they crossed the Jordan. The concept of a punishment that wasn't to an individual, was to a community, was to a society. God didn't introduce the idea of a corporal punishment until they entered the land of Israel. Because then the concept of responsibility took over. That you're responsible for another person. Not you're loving another person. Loving another person is not a communal thing, it's an individual act. Okay. Once this got established as an idea, of course, in the world of commentaries, they worked their way back to say that although it starts in the land of Israel, and it starts when the community was developed, but the idea has roots even before they went to the land of Israel. And I'm not going to go through everybody's conversations, I'm just going to tell you, because for the sake of having a broader scope. It's my C on the page, we don't have to work on it, but there's a Mechilta de Rabbi Shmuel, it's one of these beautiful medrashes from one of the Talmudic scholars in the times of the destruction of the Second Temple, that he actually incorporates this idea into the Ten Commandments. That already God spoke about this in the Ten Commandments, that there's an idea of communal responsibility. It might have not had any way of playing itself out until the Jews went to the land of Egypt. To Israel. But it was there. Then there are commentaries that go back to the story of Benjamin and Judah. You remember the story of Benjamin and Judah? That after Joseph was not revealing himself to the brothers, he told the brothers, you got to go home and bring the youngest one.
Take me, not him.
And before they even said, take me, not him, Judah said to Jacob, I guarantee to bring this child home. And then when Joseph took Benjamin, in the arguments of Judah to Joseph was, you should know I guaranteed my father that I'm going to bring. And so all of a sudden, for a sin that he didn't do, what did he do? Judah did nothing. This is something that Joseph threw on on Benjamin. But the concept of being responsible. And so some of the commentaries already go back to Genesis to speak about that, although there wasn't a community yet, but the concept was being planted already in the Torah, that there's a concept of not just loving another person, which is an individual act to individual people, but there's this communal, the tzibur, the community that all of a sudden we share responsibility, and in sharing that responsibility, because we share a people and we share a land and we share an identity, we are responsible for another person. And when we hurt that, what we're sharing, that responsibility becomes our problem. Becomes the reality that I have to live with, that out of my responsibility, I now have part of the crime. Because of that responsibility. Let me just tell you that this idea of this communal responsibility, although its origins was established in a negative setting, where the Talmud structures it about when we do something wrong in a communal setting, that we now are responsible for the wrong, and we can't separate ourselves from it and say, I'm just an individual. No, you are part of this community setting. And therefore, if you're part of this community setting, it's a communal responsibility. And the negative is shared as well. I want to tell you that there are those rabbis that flipped it to the positive. And all of a sudden walked in and started to speak about out of responsibility, you can do something for another person. So for example, when you have Friday night, and one man stands up and recites the Kiddush, and everybody listens to the Kiddush and answers Amen. And then they sit down and enjoy the meal. 1 second, why are you not making Kiddush? Why are you not making Kiddush? Why does one guy have a right to stand up and recite the Kiddush? It's everybody should be making a Kiddush. And the answer is that he has a right to take responsibility for other people in fulfilling a good deed. And now by you answering Amen, it's as if you're saying, I give you that right to represent me. And why do I have a right to represent you? Because we're interconnected to each other. So let me show you this in the Talmud. Very simple words. One of the original commentators was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki Rashi, and the Talmud is talking about blowing the shofar. How a person can stand up and blow the shofar, and other people don't have to blow the shofar, which happens in the average temple of Rosh Hashanah. You got the guy who blows the shofar, he makes the blessings, everybody answers Amen, and one guy blows. What is one guy? We should all take turns. It might take 17 hours to get through the service, but why should one guy blow? Or maybe everybody blow at the same time, everybody come with the shofar, and just everybody blow at the same time. Why is someone doing it for you? So Rashi says, look at Rashi. It's the last, I know it's in Hebrew. But the English, they put it in the English. If you look at the last lines in English. For all Jews are responsible for one another. So all of a sudden, because you're responsible for each other, you can do something positive for someone else. And that positive act, so they use this argument of this communal responsibility, that when you create a community event, somebody has a right to, now in that communal setting, but if it's not a community event, like for example, there's a law that says you're allowed to get married through an emissary. Right? You don't have to stand under the chuppah. By the way, you don't have to stand if you didn't want to stand under the chuppah. Now I told you. You don't need. You can send an emissary to represent you under the chuppah. Now imagine you have a couple. It's a girlfriend, boyfriend. And they're very happy. And one guy says, you know what, I think they're happy. I'll make a representative without telling them. I'll make a representative for the guy, I'll get a representative for a girl, I'll marry them. And they have no idea that and then you come and inform them, it's a good thing to be married. And we're all interconnected to each other. I decided that you guys can be married, and out of the fact that I'm responsible for everybody, I didn't. No, you can't do that. Oh. you can't do
I was getting ready for my kids.
You can't do that. It has to be a communal setting. And in that communal setting, that what's realized, and it's obvious in the room, is that what's taking place is a community activity, that one person can say, I take the responsibility to represent everybody. And the fact that no one in the room stands up and says, no, don't represent me, but they answer Amen, that Amen is a different word saying, I agree with you being the one to represent me. And all of a sudden, the concept of we're interconnected to each other allows me to do something for you in a communal setting. Or else, why can't I do that? Why do I have a right to take away the responsibility from you and represent you? What right do I have to do that? So therefore, all of a sudden, you realize that this idea of a communal responsibility, it goes both ways. That God allowed it to be, in a sense, in the positive sense, but also in the negative sense. And in the negative sense, it could be because we're a community. So I want to tell you, in Jewish law, it's an interesting law. It's a very interesting law. It's a complicated law. The law is about a person who has to go into a city of refuge. Did a crime by accident, and they had cities of refuge. So the Talmud has a law. And the law is that his teacher goes with him.
I didn't know.
Yep.
Well,
He has to want the teacher to go. But if he wants his teacher to be there with him, the teacher goes. That means I, or anybody who's a teacher, now takes responsibility for the people that are in my community. And therefore, whatever that community struggles with, I have to be part of that struggle. I can't wipe my hands clean and say, I have nothing to do with this person. No, you're a communal person, you're a teacher. And he was part of your community. And if he's part of your community, you carry the responsibilities. To the degree the Talmud is going to go, that the teacher should go, the teacher has to go along with the student into exile. It's this.
so the community has the right to officially as community reject a member, say he is.
Oh, absolutely.
That is key.
Absolutely.
Only after that,
Correct.
not responsible
Correct.
for him.
A community has a right. It was called a cheder. It was called excommunication, where they looked at a person and said, "You're doing wrong," and as a community, we don't carry the responsibility for what you're doing.
And if we don't have a community leadership or community mechanism, how to
It's a
reject,
problem. It's a problem.
and that's where we are at right now.
But we're in exile, so therefore we don't have all the mechanisms in place.
Key-
We're in American society. We don't have the authority to reject people. We live by American law, and therefore the concept of what a community is responsible for each other is a lot different than what this original idea is. Because in this original idea, when we controlled the whole system, you had a right to say on all levels. But even today, and I don't want to go there right now, but I'll go there, Leo, for you, but it's not that simple even to implement any of this today. Because the question is, how do you implement it when you truly can't create a community? There's other influences. How can I take responsibility for a person doing wrong when I'm not the only influence? So in a time when the community was a tight-knit community with an adherence to a system, and then the system failed, as a community it failed. But I can't say that today a system failed. How can I say that? I'm not the only influence, you're not the only influence, parents are not the only influence. And by the way, the influence is growing in leaps and bounds. Because it's not only about neighbors, it's about the internet. That takes up more time with our children than the neighbors take up, than friends take up. And that influence is unbelievable. It's a different society. So I don't know exactly, and you're right, how do I take this and apply it today? So when it's in a tight-knit synagogue, and it's blowing the shofar, and it's a controlled environment, or even to a certain degree what we do with the Amidah, the repetition of the Amidah. What's the idea of the repetition of the Amidah? The idea of the repetition of the Amidah was the central prayer. It was the prayer. And people didn't know how to pray. And people didn't know how to read Hebrew. And it was memorized. Because there was no reading going on besides the Bible. So if you had a people that came to synagogue prior to the oral tradition being written, they had to memorize the Amidah. If they never learned the Amidah properly, they never memorized it, they would come to synagogue, and up stood one person who had it memorized and said the Amidah. But that's a controlled environment with one purpose, with a cohesive leadership, hopefully, and that controls the environment, and says to people, we're doing the Amidah, and you answer Amen. And that's where it comes from. It comes when one person takes responsibility for others. Okay. So I want to tell you, in Jewish law, they took this idea of the positive commandment, that you can fulfill the obligation in a positive way, not only the way the Torah originally couched the idea of responsibility in a negative setting, but as the rabbis moved it from the negative in Jewish law to the positive, how you can fulfill an obligation in a communal way for another person became major debates. And what were the major debates? The major debates was, what's the balance in the community? Because in the balance in the community, there's male and female, there's children. Some have certain obligations, some don't have obligations. Some have no obligations. How do you create this responsibility for each other when they're not responsible? Or the person who wants to be the leader of responsibility doesn't have that obligation. So how do you take responsibility for it? And that's where all these laws of questions of how the interaction of men and women and how to incorporate children in services. So you'll never see in any city a child lead the Amidah. Why not? Put up a 9-year-old kid who knows the Amidah. It's beautiful. He's a 9-year-old kid. I can get you a lot of 9-year-old kids that can lead a service, that can do the Amidah, the repetition. Why can't the child do that? So a child will do something in the beginning. He'll do the Aleinu at the end. We'll do all these little shticks to have the child, but he'll never do the Amidah. Why not? Because he's not responsible. Too young. He's before his bar and bat mitzvah. And if he's before his bar and bat mitzvah, there's no responsibility. If there's no responsibility, how can he fulfill the obligation for someone who's responsible? Because we are interconnected to each other. But we're not in this thing interconnected. I don't have a responsibility. And if I don't have the responsibility, I can't say to you, I'm going to fulfill your responsibility. I'm not responsible. That's where all these laws and all these major arguments in Jewish law developed to understand how, for example, I'll give you these questions in flip cases. Right, for example, it's the obligation of women to light Friday night candles. Can a man say, I'm going to fulfill the obligation for the room? I'll make the blessing. All the women in the room say amen. I'll light the candle, and you don't have to light the candles. 1 second. It's a woman's obligation. It's not your obligation. You can't get up there and light the candle and make the blessing and have the women answer amen. You can't fulfill a mitzvah for someone else who you're not, when you're not, or vice versa. A woman's going to come into the room and say, listen, I don't have to, technically women don't have the obligation of prayer because it's established times, for whatever reason, they're not obligated in prayer. I'll lead the services. That's the problem. That's the whole entanglement. Can a person who's not obligated fulfill, because it's all based on the fact that I'm responsible for you. But to be responsible for you, I have to be responsible as well. And if I'm not responsible, then I can't share the responsibility. This is where, because they base the whole premise of one person doing something for another on the fact that we are responsible for each other, the moment that becomes the premise to why you do something, it opens up the whole wide smorgasbord of questions. Where all of a sudden, can someone who's not responsible do it for somebody who's responsible? Can someone responsible do it for somebody who's not responsible? And all this, because it's all based on responsibility. And we have to share the responsibility. If we don't share the responsibility, it doesn't work. You get it? That's where all of a sudden in Jewish law, because they took this idea of responsibility for each other into the positive side, not into the negative side, but into the positive side, that now it's the reason why you have a right to fulfill a mitzvah, and through the fulfillment of the mitzvah, you bring along people with you. And the premise to that is because we're responsible for each other, so that opened up the whole conversation to understand how does it work when there's a part of the people that have the obligation and part doesn't. From children to adults, from adults to children, from one segment of the adults to another segment of the adults, all these conversations, which is problematic. So, for example, let's even talk amongst men, amongst themselves. There are certain mitzvahs that once you have done it, you can't fulfill someone else's responsibility because you're not responsible anymore. You're done. You've done it. So if I have davened shachrit, and then walks a group of 10 people say, Rabbi, I would like you to daven shachrit now. Get up there and do the amidah for us. I can't do it. It's redundant to me. I've done it already. I don't have the responsibility to daven shachrit anymore. So the fact that there's 10 people in the room now, that all the 10 people say we can't read Hebrew. You get up there now and repeat the shachrit again and fulfill our obligation. Problematic. Because the whole premise of for me able to fulfill your obligation is because we're responsible. I'm not responsible anymore. I fulfilled my responsibility. I can't, that communal act, I can't be part of. So that's where, of this concept of communal act becomes the whole premise to multiple laws that go into this understanding. Okay? But it's entirely bound by the fact that we believe that we're not talking about individuals anymore. We're talking about a community now. If Judaism was made up of a bunch of individuals, and the whole beauty of Judaism is individuality, there would be no such a thing as I'm responsible for you. I have to love you, but when you go do something wrong, don't hold me accountable. I have nothing to do with it.
Can I reject personally this wrongdoer? Say, you're not from my point of view.
Oh, Leo. So this is, I'm not going to Leo. So this is really an amazing whole take in Judaism, where all of a sudden Judaism has the ability to say there's a two-tier relationship that God wants. There's a relationship of the individual to the individual, and that is couched in love, that you need to love someone else. And there's even a flip side to the love, that you should, when you see someone doing something wrong, rebuke him. That's the other side of loving him. Because if you truly love somebody, you don't let that person do that wrong. Right? So when you see your child do something wrong, you rebuke the child. Another person's child, who cares? That's wrong. Because what you're saying really is, the reason why this child is important, because I love this child. And that child I don't love. It's a reflect of your love that tells you which one you rebuke or not. That's wrong. You should love everybody. You have to know how to rebuke people. You gotta know how to rebuke people without rejecting. God doesn't say reject the person. And that's where we make mistakes sometimes. We rebuke and it becomes a form of rejection. We can't do that. But that's the flip side of love. That's not a communal thing. That's individual one-on-one. And then God introduces a communal thing. The land of Israel, we're interconnected with each other, we become responsible for each other. So I want to talk to you about this communal thing, because this communal thing, to a certain degree, is where it's not about the individuals, it's about the collective group, right? So when a person stands up there in the synagogue and leads the service, he's not thinking about, I'm fulfilling the obligation for this one, and I have to go through the room and make sure everybody knows No, you're part of this communal reality, and the moment that I stand up there and you answer Amen, I don't have to think about you personally. It's not about you personally.
It's a congregation.
It's the congregation. If the guy who blows the shofar and there's 1,500 people in the room, and he's obligated to know everybody individually, and to speak to each one individually and say, I know that it'll be impossible. When it comes to a communal, the individual melts into this communal oneness. And in this oneness, it's not about me having to deal with each one in particular. It's to the contrary. Now, when it comes to the individual love, by the way, it's the exact opposite. Don't walk into 3 people and make believe that there's no separation between them, and I just love you all. No, that's very insulting to the people. Why? Because I'm not like the other person. And the type of love I need from you is different than the type of love I need that this person needs. So don't just make a blanket statement saying, I love you all. That's very insulting. You don't say I love you all day. Everybody has different realities. And if you need to understand each one's reality and truly love them individually. They're different. Don't use communal language when it comes to loving people.
Especially at this table.
No, at any table. Don't use it with your children. Because your children's even more insulting. Because each child looks at you and says, 1 second. My love with you and that child's love with you is different. I'm responsible for all of you. That's a communal thing. Yes, I take responsibility for the room. But when you speak communal language about love, doesn't come off right. That has to be an individual. You love each one for their particular personality, their particular need. Okay. I want to walk into the Rebbe. Page 3. We'll do it quickly. I know because I'm running out of time. I want to tell you the Rebbe. The Rebbe picked on a very interesting Talmud. The Rebbe goes back to the original concept of the word, Araven. Everybody's a guarantor, Araven. And there's a Talmud that has a debate about, forget about communion. The Talmud goes into the debate about the concept of the legal responsibility of being a guarantor. So those that have married off children or been at Orthodox weddings knows about the concept of a guarantor. At an Orthodox wedding, you'll have usually, maybe even by conservative weddings, they have it. There's a contract signed, not the ketubah. It's called the t'nayim. It's the agreement to show up at the wedding. It's the bride and groom committing themselves to show up at the wedding. It's the parents of the bride and groom committing themselves to put on the wedding. And then there's guarantors. Outsiders that guarantee that if the parents don't come up with the money for the wedding, they guarantee to make sure the wedding takes place. And the beautiful thing in the Orthodox community, they do it 5 minutes before the chuppah. Everything has been paid for already. Everything is all done and over with already. But the truth is that they used to do this a year before the wedding. This was done, and what we have today, a chuppah, and the putting the ring on the finger, it was really 2 separate events. There was this writing of a contract and putting the ring on the finger, and then there was a year break. That was the betrothal. And then came the marriage, which was a year later, and the bride and groom didn't live together that period. And then there was a chuppah a year later. What they did, because it became a whole issue, sometimes they broke up in the middle. And when they broke up in the middle, it became a whole issue of what kind of divorce to give them. Because they weren't yet living together. So they said it was complicated law. So they said, stop, let's bring everything together. And let's do the betrothal and the marriage at the same time. The placing the ring on the finger and the 7 brachot and the whole chuppah. Just do it all together. And in many communities, they dropped that contract because the contract doesn't make sense anymore. What's the purpose of having the t'nayim if we're standing at the marriage and we're about to get married and the caterer is catering and the band is in place? What are you writing a contract about them responsible to show up? We're here. But tradition is tradition, and in the Orthodox world, they don't give up tradition that easily.
And checks bounce.
And tradition is tradition, so they have the contract there, and part of that contract is 2 guarantors. Which is a legal binding. These guarantors, it's a legal binding.
Do you know of any cases where they...
By the way, without being sarcastic, I think a majority of my family's weddings, I think one of my brothers who's bankrupt was one of the guarantors. We put him up as a guarantor. He was laughing. He says, "You can have my suit now if that's what the collateral damage is." But anyways, all joking aside, it's a form of commitment. So the question is, in Jewish law, where do you see in Jewish law the concept of a guarantor? That it's a legally. So in Jewish law, by the way, we know about a contract, the costs of law, Torah says you shall write to her a divorce. It was a contract to break. We know about finances. It speaks about Abraham buying the land. So you see in Jewish law the idea of a financial connection. You see these forms, and that's why they know that if find a chuppah, you put a ring, which is money. There's a ketubah, which is a contract. We have all these ideas. We know that the relationship is a form of bonding because the Torah speaks about it, that he took her to his house. Over and over, the Torah says that Isaac took Rivka home. That the intimacy was a way of fomenting a relationship. So you have these different terminology which speaks about a bonding and a connection. But where you see guarantors? So the Talmud has a debate. One place the Talmud says is from going back to Benjamin and Judah. That the argument that Judah gave to Joseph was, I guaranteed my father. I'm a guarantor. So that's one place. Another place is very interesting. It's in Mishlei in Proverbs. There's a whole chapter 20 in Proverbs, that speaks about the different transactions and financial commitments of people. It's very interesting. King Solomon wrote about the land of Israel and how the economy should work. It's an interesting chapter in Proverbs. It's nothing poetic about love affairs. It's really a whole chapter of his view of economy. And in there's a line that says that if he's a guarantor, take from him his garment. Know what he's putting up as collateral. That's what King Solomon writes. So the Talmud says we have two different cases. So Rav Huna says, I like the one from Judah. Chisda says, I like what Solomon speaks about the garment. And the Rebbe goes into a halachic conversation. What's the difference between the two opinions? And the Rebbe, interesting, I'm not going to walk you through because it's an amazing piece, but just the thought. The Rebbe says there's two ways of looking at a guarantor. That you personally become responsible, period. You now are in the place of the person who took the loan. You'll only end up being responsible for the money, but it's not about the money, it's about you as a person. Judah looked at Joseph and said, my whole being is responsible. Here I am, replace me, take him out, put me in. It's not about what he stole. I know I am responsible. I, as a human, my whole being. Or no, look at the story in Proverbs, and he doesn't speak about that the guarantor becomes the whole. It talks about his jacket, his collateral. Nothing else becomes responsible. The guy's, whatever the financial commitment is, beyond that, I'm not attached to this story. I haven't committed myself beyond that couple of kupkas, that couple of dollars that I wrote down. Don't you connect me to this guy, don't connect me to the person who took the loan. Beyond that, I don't connect my whole being. That's the difference the Rebbe says. And the Rebbe says that he works out different scenarios in law where it will make a difference, one or the other. But then the Rebbe says, I want to go away, after the Rebbe goes to this whole halachic, the Rebbe goes into this idea of what we're talking about, communal responsibility. And the Rebbe points out the two different positions in communal responsibility. It's an amazing thing. The Rebbe says like this. The Rebbe says there's two ways to look at it when we become a community. We can become a community, but we really never lose our individuality. We don't give up our and therefore there's still someone on top, there's still someone on bottom. Yeah, we're a community, but there's a president and a vice president. There's a rabbi, there's not a rabbi. But that's not truly a one. That's not truly one. If you still can identify individuals, and that's the story about the guarantor, the one that's only the garment. There's separation. Although I'm responsible, but let me tell you which part is responsible. My garment. Don't talk to me about something beyond that. Then comes a higher and deeper truth about the unity of our responsibility. That you know what it ends up being? we're one. There's no separation. There's no looking at compartmentalizing. We as a community have become one. Period. Don't start identifying individual. My whole being is guaranteeing another person. Because that person and me are one. Correct. And it goes beyond, and the Rebbe was very powerful. He says, when you talk about communal responsibility, I become one with the community becomes one with me. And don't look at high or low. It's not. It's a communal reality. We're one being. And in that one being, we're all one. And don't create divisions in the one. And therefore, to a certain degree, I go back to the story I started. You know what the Rebbe looked at him? The Rebbe said, you make it sound like I am a great person sitting in a chair, and no, we're one. And that letter on the floor that I have to pick up is I'm picking up myself. It's all, I don't look at it as if how do you, as a great person, not allow yourself? No, I'm responsible. And in the concept of responsibility, there's no differentiation. It becomes one being. That's what the idea of communal responsibility is. Yes, there's other aspects in Judaism which are individual, you have to stand out. That's not the idea of this concept in Judaism. This concept in Judaism of a guarantor, of we are responsible for each other, is the communal concept. And in the communal concept is, don't create divisions. Don't come around and say, I shouldn't be bending down. That there's someone on the floor, he belongs there. I belong in a position that I don't bend down. Don't go there. Out of responsibility for another Jew, we're one being. And in that one being, there's no divisions of people. We're one body. Don't even talk about the head and the foot. We're one being. We're all the head, we're all the foot, we're all everything.
As strong as your weakest link, correct?
And that weakest link becomes me as well. And the weakest link is as strong as the best link. Because we're all one. And with that, the Rebbe turned around and said, that's how I view the concept of Kol Yisrael Aleinu Zeh B'Zeh. That's how I view the beauty of being responsible for each other, where the oneness of the people gets to the point where there's no division of people anymore. And that's the significance of responsibility. It's highlighting the aspect of not the individuality of people. It's highlighting the aspect of the community. And we are one. And part of the gravest sins that just happened in the story of Pittsburgh was people who highlighted the division of people and belittled the people that were in that synagogue, because they were looking at them and seeing the division instead of having the ability to understand that it's one body. There's a dimension of Judaism which we're responsible for each other. And in that responsibility, don't separate people. We're all one. And in that oneness, we shine. But there were those that didn't understand what the concept of we are one in its true meaning, when the truth of a communal concept is at its greatest height, is when people don't even see a separation between each other, is a community that's one without division. Have a beautiful day, everybody.
Thank you.